The light was going at Cold Harbor Yard when the man arrived. Dusk pressing in from the east, the last of the September sun dragging long shadows across the gateposts, and a horse beneath him that had given everything it had and was asking, very quietly, to stop. Susannah Tarrant had seen blown horses before. She had seen men who did not notice them too, and this one was 4 days of road mud from boot to thigh, sitting straight in the saddle the way a man sits when he is too tired to slump. And she crossed the yard with her bucket and thought, whoever he has come a long way for something he should have written about first. She was not wrong. She was not prepared either, for what the something turned out to be, or for the way this particular man said the true thing. Plainly, without softening it, as though the truth were not a weapon but a fact. And facts were simply what people exchanged when they spoke to one another. Susannah had not met many people who spoke that way. By the time she understood what it cost him and what it was going to cost her, the horse was already at the trough, and the summer was already over, and there was no going back to the woman she had been before the gate opened. He asked to see the master of the yard. Susannah set her bucket down at the edge of the trough and looked at him. "The master of the yard is not receiving visitors," she said. "You should have written. You can come back Thursday." "I have ridden from Stormont," the man said. That was foolish. She meant it, and her voice said so without apology. "It is still Thursday." He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is accustomed to being told yes and has not yet decided whether no is a temporary condition or a permanent one. "I have a horse in some difficulty," he said. "I was told the yard at Cold Harbor was the place." "There are other yards between here and Stormont," Susannah said. "Several of them better placed for a man who cannot be troubled to write." "I did write," he said, 3 times. She picked up her bucket. "Then you have your answer. Thursday. May I at least water the horse?" She stopped. The animal behind him was standing with its head low and its sides moving too fast, and it was not the animal's fault. It had been ridden 4 days without sufficient rest. And whatever she thought of the man, the horse had done nothing to deserve thirst on top of it. She turned back to the trough. "You may water the horse," she said. "You may not come back Thursday expecting a different answer than the one you will have received by then." "What answer is that?" "That the master of the yard cannot help you." He was dismounting, stiffly, she noticed, which meant the 4 days had cost him as well. And he said without looking at her, "Is the master of the yard in the habit of sending answers through the stable hand?" Across the yard, a boy's voice cut through the early dark. "Miss Tarrant." The Greys kicked her water over again. The man stopped with one boot on the ground and one still in the iron. Susannah did not move for a moment. She had known, from the second he mentioned letters, that the moment was coming, and she had been hoping to have Thursday between herself and it. She had not had Thursday. She turned and looked at him with the particular stillness she used in a loose box when a horse was deciding whether to trust her. And she waited. He reached into the saddlebag without hurrying. He produced 3 letters, folded, refolded, the creases of a man who reads and sets down and picks up again. He held them out to her across the horse's back. She took them. She did not need to look at the signatures. She had written them at the kitchen table in February, in March, and in the last week of April, in answer to questions about coach horse confirmation that had been the most interesting correspondence she had received in 6 years of running the yard alone. "They are mine," she said. "Yes," said Gabriel Ashe, Duke of Stormont. "I told you in the last one that I could not help you." "You did," he said. "Then you have come 4 days on the road to be told the same thing in person, which is not an efficient use of your time or your horse." She folded the letters and set them on the saddle flap. I will have Peter take him. He is blown, and he needs the trough slowly, not all at once. She took the horse's bridle herself, because the animal was exhausted and fractious, and she was not going to hand that off to a boy in the dark. And she led it toward the water. And the Duke of Stormund stood in the middle of the Cold Harbor yard and watched her. And she could feel the weight of his watching on her back the whole way. 9 weeks before that evening, Susannah had been standing in the subscription assembly room at Bramber Cross, and the room had been full, and Mrs. Honoria Quiller had delivered her verdict in front of 40 people with the particular precision of a woman who has rehearsed it. "My dear," Mrs. Quiller had said, and the "my dear" was the worst of it. The tone of it, the way it placed Susannah below her, before a single word of substance had been spoken. "I think you must understand, we all think you must understand, that Ambrose requires someone rather more suited to his position. Someone who can be presented, you know, without—" And here the pause, deliberate, a pause that did the work the words were too polite to do. "Without difficulty." Susannah had looked at Ambrose Quiller, who was 36 years old and had his mother's money and his father's weak chin, and had been engaged to Susannah for 11 months. He was looking at the floor. He had been looking at the floor since his mother began speaking. He did not look up. 40 people were watching. Some of them were kind enough to be ashamed of what they were watching. Most of them were not. Susannah set her glass down on the nearest surface, which was a side table she had never touched before and would never touch again. She crossed the room to the door. She did not answer. There was nothing to answer that would not cost her more than the silence. And she had always known, in the part of herself she kept very quiet, that the room had never entirely been hers to stand in. The next morning she was up at 4, as she had been every morning of her life. Back at Cold Harbor in the present, with the Duke's horse standing at the trough and the yard settling into its evening quiet, Susannah told him what the mare was. 16 hands, dark bay, 3 years unhandled, and she has put 2 men on the ground since the summer, she said. Every trainer in 3 counties has told you the same sensible thing. They have, the Duke said, and you refuse. I do, he said. Then you are here because you believe I will tell you something different. She looked at him across the yard, where Peter was forking the evening hay. I will not tell you something different. I will tell you the same thing they told you. And I will also tell you that I cannot afford 11 weeks on one horse, and that a dukedom's opinion of this yard is worth nothing to the people I sell to. My buyers are farmers and coaching companies and the occasional country gentleman who wants a sensible animal for his daughter. They do not read the peerage. I was not offering to endorse you, the Duke said. No. You were offering to pay me a great deal of money to do something I have already said cannot be done in the time available. She met his eyes directly, the way she met a horse's eyes, steadily, without aggression, simply to establish where they both stood. Every horse in my book is entered in the register under my father's name, because the register will not take a woman's. The 11 acres under this yard are leasehold from the Quiller Bank, and you will have heard what happened at Bramber Cross in July, and you will understand what that means for my position there. This is the whole of it. I am not fishing for sympathy. I am telling you that my margin is what it is, and I cannot spend it on one animal that may not come right at all. The Duke was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the yard the way she had looked at his letters, with the attention of a man who is reading something carefully and not rushing to his conclusion. Let me see the mare, he said. She took him to the 6th loose box at the far end of the yard, where the mare stood in the corner with her ears flat and her weight back on her hindquarters. the posture of an animal that had learned, over 3 years of being left alone with her own grief, that everything that came through a door was a threat. The Duke stood at the half door and said nothing. He stood there for a long time. "Her name?" he said at last. "I call her the Bay," Susannah said. He nodded once, as though that answer told him something. 6 weeks, he said. "What would 6 weeks cost me?" Susannah told him. She named the day rate without softening it, and added the condition without apology. He would leave the horse and go home, and she would send him a written report at the end of each fortnight. Those were the terms. There was no negotiation built into them. "I will stay," the Duke said. "That is not one of the terms." "No," he said. "It is not." He took rooms at the Bramber Cross Inn, the best rooms, which were not very good, and he appeared at the Cold Harbor gate the following morning at 4 o'clock in shirt sleeves, with his coat over his arm and his boots already muddy, asking where the barrows were kept. Susannah stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then she pointed him toward the implement shed without a word. He was useless with a barrow. He had the knowledge. She discovered this within the first hour, when he asked a question about the Bay's shoulder angle that nobody without serious study would have known to ask. But the knowledge lived entirely in his head and had not yet reached his hands, and he moved through the physical work of the yard with the careful incompetence of a man who is genuinely trying and has no pretension about how badly it is going. He did not apologize. He did not make a performance of his effort. He simply did the work badly and came back the next morning and did it again. By the end of the first week, the county had noticed. There was no version of a Duke mucking out at Cold Harbor Yard that could be unseen. The grooms at the Quiller house had seen him. The women at the market had seen him. The men at the Bramber Cross Inn had eaten their supper 3 tables away from him every evening for 5 nights. A Duke, in shirt sleeves, working the yard of the woman Mrs. Quiller had dismissed in July. The construction was obvious, and obvious construction spread fast in a market town. And Susannah knew it, and the Duke knew she knew it, and neither of them named it, because naming it would require them to address it, and addressing it would require one of them to leave. She did not ask him to leave. Not yet. The letters became conversation. This was the thing she had not prepared for. In the letters, in February, in March, in April, she had been brief and specific and professional, because Mr. S. Tarrant of Cold Harbor did not have time for lengthy correspondence, and because the questions deserved precise answers, not elaboration. She had been good at it. She had liked it, in the way she liked any work that required her to think carefully and say the true thing cleanly. At close range, with his face visible, it was harder to be brief. He asked questions the way he had in the letters, specific, detailed, without preamble. But in person the questions sat between them differently, because she could see when he understood her answer and when he did not. And when he did not, she had to find another way in. And finding another way in required her to think about what she actually knew and why she knew it, which was more exposure than correspondence allowed. The mare's progress was slow and untriumphant. A step nearer the door, an ear that swiveled toward a voice instead of away from it. The willingness, on the 9th day, to take hay from a hand rather than waiting until the hand had withdrawn. Small things. Susannah noted them in her book, without sentiment. One evening, near the end of the 2nd week, she was in the 6th loose box after dark, and the Duke came in behind her, and she passed him the lead rope without looking, hand to hand, because a rope must never be dropped between 2 people in a box with a frightened animal. The drop itself a sound that could undo an hour's work. His palm crossed hers in the dark. Neither of them released until the other had a firm grip. It took perhaps 2 seconds. She was very aware afterward of exactly where his hand had been. 3 days later, the mare swung her hindquarters without warning. The sudden, violent pivot of a horse that has decided it is done. And the Duke stepped between the animal and Susannah. He did not touch her. He simply moved his body into the space between them, instinctively, the way a man steps in front of something he does not want hit. And it was entirely the wrong thing to do because he was now standing in the dangerous place, and he did not know how to stand there. "Move to her shoulder," Susannah said, and her voice was not entirely steady. Her left shoulder now, and face toward her head, not away from it. "If you stand where you are and she goes again, you have nowhere to go." He moved. He did it correctly. The mare settled. "You must never do that," Susannah said. She was watching the mare's ears, not his face. "If she goes for me, I know how to get out of it. If she goes for you in that position, I have to choose between the horse and getting to you, and I cannot choose between them quickly enough." "I understand," he said. She did not tell him that the unsteadiness in her voice had not been about the mare. She did not think she needed to. A week after that, she was teaching him weight, the specific pressure of a flat palm against a horse's neck that means, I am here. I am not pushing. I am simply present. And she took his wrist and set his hand where it needed to be, and held it there. Her thumb over his pulse, telling him to stop pushing forward with his fingers and wait for the animal to lean into the contact. She had done this with 100 hands over 9 years of working with other people's horses. His hand was still under hers for 15 seconds, and the mare's ear came around, and Susannah released his wrist and stepped back and said, "There, that is what you were waiting for." And neither of them said anything else about it, and both of them were very quiet for the rest of that evening. Mrs. Quiller moved in the 4th week. The hunt subscription withdrew its custom first, a letter, civil, no stated reason, the kind of withdrawal that meant everything and said nothing. 4 county livery contracts followed within a fortnight, each departure conducted with the same civil absence of stated reason. And Susannah received each letter and set it on the kitchen table, and did the arithmetic it represented, and the arithmetic was not good. Ambrose Quiller appeared at the Cold Harbor gate on a Thursday morning. He sat his horse at the entrance and looked at the yard and did not dismount. And Susannah came out to meet him with her hands in her work gloves and waited. "I wanted to see that you were all right," he said. Susannah looked at him. "I am working," she said, "as I have been every Thursday for 9 years." "Susannah, you haven't written," she said. "In 9 weeks, you have not written the word sorry. And I was waiting for it, and I am telling you now that I have stopped waiting. And you have lost the chance to be forgiven, which is something you will have to carry rather than me." She pulled off one glove, and then the other. "The word I expected from you cost nothing. You did not send it. That is the whole of what I have to say to you." Ambrose looked at her with the expression of a man who knows he deserves exactly what he is receiving and is not large enough to say so. He turned his horse and rode back toward the town. What surprised Susannah, walking back to the yard, was how little it cost her to say. She had rehearsed that sentence for 9 weeks, convinced it would come out broken, convinced the old habit of managing herself in front of the Quillers would close her throat. It had not. The fear she felt saying it had not been fear of Ambrose at all. It had been a habit, worn so long she had mistaken it for something real. That night, a gelding went down with colic. They walked the horse in turns through the dark hours, 20 minutes each, then a rest, then 20 minutes more. the animal's distress slowly easing as the night wore on. At 3 in the morning, Susannah sat down in the straw of the loose box to rest her eyes for 1 minute. And she opened them to first light coming gray through the high window, and the horse was standing quiet, and her cheek was against the Duke's shoulder. Neither of them moved. The horse blew softly through its nose. Somewhere in the yard, a sparrow started up. The light came on in increments, the way light does in September, not rushing. Her name was Eliza, the Duke said. He said it without being asked, without any preamble, the way he said everything. Plainly, as though the words had been waiting a long time to be outside him, and he was simply allowing them out. She was 26, he said. It was a fever, 3 days, and then it was finished. I was with her at the end. There is nothing I could have done differently, and I have known that from the first morning after. A pause. I have not said her name once since the funeral. Not once, in 3 years, to anyone. Susannah did not move. She did not offer comfort, because she could hear that comfort was not what was needed. What was needed was someone to receive the words without flinching, and she could do that. The mare was hers, he said. She bred her herself, from a gray she had as a girl. After, I could not touch her. I could not send her away either. They sat in the straw until the yard began to wake around them, and the horse stood quiet between them and the morning. And Susannah understood that something had been handed to her in that hour that she had not been given permission to name yet. The offer came on a Tuesday. He found her in the yard after the evening feed and said he had something to propose. And she set down her notes and listened, because he was not a man who wasted words, and she had learned to receive what he said without preparing her answer before he had finished. Head of the Stormont stables, 4 days from Bramber Cross. Her breeding line entered in the register under Stormont patronage, which was the only way in England it would ever be entered under anything other than her dead father's name. It was a generous offer. It was an honest offer. It saved everything she had built and removed the one injustice she had spent 9 years pretending did not matter. It saved the work, and it lost the name. Susannah walked the yard until 2 in the morning. She walked it in the particular way she worked through a problem that had no clean resolution. Steadily, without hurrying, covering the same ground repeatedly until the ground had nothing new to tell her. At 2 o'clock, she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and wrote him a note that said, I am grateful. I cannot accept it. The work and the name are not separable things. St. She slid it under the door of the implement shed, where he kept his outdoor coat, and went to bed and lay awake until 4, and got up when the clock said 4 because that was what she did. That same night, later, she learned this afterward, Ambrose Quiller came to the gate a second time. He came without his horse, on foot, at an hour when he could be certain his mother was asleep. He stood at the gate and spoke in a low voice, and what he said was this. The letter that had brought the Duke 4 days on the road was his. Written in February, signed with her father's name, sent because he had stood in a room full of people and said nothing and could not live with the full weight of that, and could do one small, cowardly, decent thing afterward in ink. He asked her not to tell his mother. Susannah stood in the yard and listened, and when he had finished, she said, Go home, Ambrose. She stood in the dark after the gate closed, and she turned the fact over in her hands the way you turn a stone to find its weight. The chance that had changed her summer, the letter, the correspondence, the Duke riding 4 days on a blown horse, had been handed to her by the man who failed her. Not as restitution, not as redemption, simply as the one small thing a weak man could do when he found, too late, that he was not large enough for the larger thing. It was not a debt she could discharge in either direction. It simply was. What Mrs. Quiller circulated next could not be answered. A duke lodging 11 weeks at an inn in Bramber Cross, spending his days at the yard of a single woman. The construction was the obvious one, and the obvious construction, once spoken aloud in a drawing room, became the truth that polite society worked with, because polite society preferred a legible story to a complicated one. Susannah could not deny it without confirming the thing she would be denying, and she had no drawing room to deny it in, and so she did not. The apprentice lads went first. Their fathers sent notes, civil, without stated reasons, identical in their civility to every other letter she had received that autumn. Peter was 14 and had been at Cold Harbor since he was 9, and he cried in the tack room before he went, with his back to her and his shoulders working. And Susannah stood in the doorway and said, "You have been the best lad this yard has had. That is a fact, and it will not change." He could not answer. He went. 11 horses and 1 woman. The farrier found himself too busy. The hay contract was not renewed. In the last week of September, the Quiller Bank called the Cold Harbor ground rent at Michaelmas and offered the freehold that same week to a buyer whose name Susannah was not given. She found the Duke at the mounting block on a Wednesday evening, and she said, "I need you to leave." He looked at her steadily. "You have become the instrument," she said. "Every loss I have had since August has been calibrated to your presence here. And if you go, the calibration stops, and I have something left to work with. If you stay, there will be nothing left by Michaelmas." She kept her voice even. It cost her. "I am not asking you to abandon the mare. I am asking you to go back to Stormont and let me finish what I started, and I will write to you when it is done." He stood up from the mounting block. He looked at the yard the way she had seen him look at it 100 times, taking it in, reading it, the way he read everything. "All right," he said. He left the next morning before 4. She heard the inn road from the kitchen window and did not go to it, and the sound of hooves on the packed earth faded north toward Stormont, and the yard was very quiet. That night, alone, she sat at the kitchen table with the register open and a pen in her hand, and she wrote 6 entries for the Michaelmas Fair at Wrenbury Green. She wrote them slowly, thinking about each one, the horse and its qualities, and what a fair buyer would want to know. She signed them S. Tarrant, Cold Harbor, her own name, her own hand, submitted to be read aloud in front of 400 people. For the first time in 9 years of work. She sealed the entries and set them by the door to go with the morning post, and sat for a long time in the kitchen with the lamp burning down. The following evening at dusk, she heard the gate. He was leading the mare, Eliza's mare, at a walk on a loose rope, the last 2 miles on foot beside her. The animal moved with a quietness it had not carried in 3 years. He looked as though he had ridden hard to get here, and then walked the last stretch slowly for the horse's sake, which was exactly what he had done. Susannah stood in the yard doorway and watched him come up the lane. She crossed the yard toward him, and she kissed him. She did it without deciding to, the way you do a thing when the decision has already been made somewhere below the level of deciding. And his hand came up and steadied her elbow, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then she stepped back and said, "I apologize. I am tired, and it does not." He kissed her again. It was the one that counted, and she did not apologize for it. Wrenbury Green at Michaelmas was 400 people, and the smell of horses and the particular noise of a fair that has been running since the morning and has found its rhythm. The ring announcer calling lots, the buyers at the rail with their catalogs, the sellers moving their animals in slow circles on the grass. Susannah had been coming to this fair since she was 7 years old, standing at her father's stirrup while he talked price with men who looked past her. The Duke arrived at the public gate with no buyers, no money, and no scheme. He asked only to stand at the rail as a customer and nothing else. He was wearing the coat he wore to the yard in the mornings, and he looked exactly like himself, which was the only way he knew how to look. The entries were read aloud before the subscription ring opened. Susannah stood near the gate and heard her name read from the official list. S. Tarrant, Cold Harbor, 6 entries, lots 41 through 46. And the sound of it in the open air, in a voice that was not hers, in front of 400 people, was a thing she had not been entirely prepared for. The man beside her at the gate, a Shropshire breeder she had sold to twice, looked at the catalogue and then at her and said, "Your father's yard?" And she said, "Mine." And he said, "Right then," and turned back to the ring. Mrs. Honoria Quiller was patroness of the subscription ring. She moved through the crowd with a card in her hand and an audience forming around her, the way an audience forms around a woman who has learned to use a room. And she arrived at the rail where Susannah was standing, with the particular expression of a woman who is about to do something in public that she has rehearsed in private. "My dear," Mrs. Quiller said. And there it was again. Those 2 words, the tone of them, the way they placed Susannah below her before a single word of substance had been spoken. And the audience around them was forming, and Susannah could feel the attention of the men at the rail shifting toward them. "I think we must all say, and you must know we say it with the greatest concern for your situation, that a woman in your circumstances, with your history, might perhaps have found someone more worthy of." "I was never asked to find someone worthy of me," Susannah said. Her hands were shaking. She was aware of the shaking, aware that the men beside her could see it, and she did not stop speaking. "I was asked to be useful and grateful," she said. "I was asked to enter my work under a dead man's name and be grateful for the register that permitted it. I was asked to stand in rooms I had not been admitted to and be grateful for the invitation. I was asked in July, in front of 40 people, to understand that I was not suited. And I crossed the room to the door, and I was grateful then too, because I did not know yet what else to be." She looked at Mrs. Quiller, not with anger, not with contempt, but with the steady directness she used in a loose box, simply establishing where they both stood. "I have recently stopped being grateful. I have been useful for 9 years, and I intend to remain so, and the rest of it I am done with." She did not wait for a reply. She walked to lot 41, the big gray gelding, her best animal, 17 months of work, and she led him out of the subscription ring and into the open sale at the east end of the field. She went back for 42 and 43, and by the time she had 44 on a rope, the buyers at the subscription rail had begun to move. Not all of them, enough of them. They got up from their places and crossed the field, following 6 horses and 1 woman, and the subscription ring stood half empty behind them, with its patroness at the rail and its catalogue in her hand. The Duke was at the open sale gate when she came through with the last 2 horses. He held the gate open without being asked and said nothing, and she went past him with her animals, and the selling began. Cold Harbor was sold. She had known it would be, and it was. And the 11 acres her father had worked his entire life passed to the buyer the Quiller Bank had found. And she did not go back to the yard after the fair to watch it happen. The county did not apologize. It mostly did not notice that it should. Mrs. Quiller kept her money and her house and her opinion, and presided over the subscription ring at Wrenbury Green for many years afterward, and the ring was smaller each time. Ambrose stayed beside his mother and was not redeemed. The damage stood. It simply stopped being the thing that decided Susannah's life. At the rail after the last lot sold, the Duke came and stood beside her. The field was emptying, the afternoon light going gold and long across the grass, and she was doing the arithmetic in her head. What the 6 horses had made, what she owed, what remained. "I did not ride 4 days for the mare," he said. She looked at him. "I rode 4 days," he said, "because I had 3 letters in my desk that were better company than anyone I had met in a decade. The letters were about shoulder confirmation and the management of a difficult mouth and the precise moment when you stop correcting and start listening. And they were written by someone who had thought carefully about every sentence. And I read them until I knew the shape of how that person thought." He was watching the last of the buyers cross the field. "I would like the correspondence to continue at closer range for the rest of my life, if that is agreeable." Susannah was quiet for a moment. The arithmetic in her head had resolved itself, finally, into a number that was not comfortable but was workable. And the 6 horses had gone to buyers who would use them well, and her name was in the official record at Wrenbury Green and would remain there regardless of what happened next. "I have 6 horses to move," she said, "and a stud to build." "I know," he said. "I am not going to be in any position to fix a date for some months." "I am content to wait," he said. "I have been waiting since February, which I did not know at the time, and it was not unpleasant." She looked at him. This man who said the true thing plainly, without strategy, without protection, who had arrived at her gate 4 days on the road and mucked out her yard, for 11 weeks and said his sister's name aloud in the straw at 4 in the morning and asked for nothing except to be allowed to stay near the work. She thought about the letters in his desk, read and refolded, and about the mare standing quiet at the gate, and about the mounting block and the kiss she had apologized for, and the one she had not. "Yes," she said. "Stuurman, 6 weeks on, first light." She was awake at 4 out of 9 years of habit, and she crossed the unfamiliar yard in her own boots, the yard larger than Cold Harbor, the smell different, the stones under her feet a different color in the pre-dawn gray. And the buildings were strange to her still. But the quality of the silence was the same silence she had known all her life. The specific quiet of a place where the work starts before the world wakes up, where the horses are breathing in the dark and the day is not yet a day, but only a possibility. A groom she had not met was coming out of the far stable with a lantern. He was young, 18, perhaps 19, and he stopped when he saw her, and he said, "Good morning, miss." "Good morning," Susannah said. He went on with his lantern toward the hay store, and she went on toward the 6th box, where the bay mare, Eliza's mare, was standing with her head over the half door, watching the yard come awake. Susannah did not explain who she was, or why she was there, or what she intended to do. She simply walked across the yard in the early light, and the mare's ears came forward, and the morning began.